Welcome back to another installment of Theologic. I'm Zach Patke.
Sean Mushton.
And we're here together again, pointing our attention to 1 Timothy chapter 5. We didn't finish what we began last time. So thanks for joining us again as we talk about, we talked about the support of widows and how practical that text was in informing us on how to serve our parents and how to bless those who are in their elderly years through the church and so on. But I want to direct our attention today. Sean and I are going to work together to talk about the nature of the character of women and service in the church that I think is so good. It parallels how the pastor is supposed to be as a servant in the church. And what I think we can see, and what I hope this will be, is particularly a blessing to the women who would listen to the explanations that we have here, because there's so much to strive for. I think the heart of every woman that loves Christ is to be the woman that she should be for Him. I want to be what I should be in my character and my practice because I love Christ, and He's worthy of what the best that I could offer Him. Well, if you're going to look for a text that describes that, 1 Timothy 5, beginning in verse 9, really is a text that I think provides a great character reality to strive for. And I think it parallels very well what we talked about 1 Timothy 3 regarding the pastor and his character traits, which is what we brought out as essentially saying this is what a mature Christian looks like. And so let's take a look a little bit at 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 9. Here we see what Paul says about putting widows on a list. And verse 9, a widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. We will start by talking a little bit about that at this time. Now, let's talk a little bit about the list that's being mentioned here in this text. The idea of a list is somewhat debatable. Some would take the idea that this is a list of support, and I could see how that seems to fit the context. But I think because of the character traits that are described here, so very well paralleling the nature of a pastor, the nature of a deacon back in chapter 3, I think there's a case to be made that the list that's being talked about is a list of women who are particularly in areas of service in the church. That they, as mature Christians, would be serving in specific ways that are related to what's described here in this text. And I don't know if the ladies, I'm sure the ladies are like me in this regard. I look back, I'm 37 years old right now, and I want to look forward. There are certain people that I look at in the church, that I have looked at in our church, a gentleman by the name of Bernie Boone, who is a part of our church. And multiple people have mentioned to me, he passed away a few years ago, and he was in his 90s when he passed. A few people mentioned to me, when I get old, I want to be like him, a person of grace, kindness, character. And there's some people that they get old and they become grumpy and so on. They become resentful. The world is changing and I don't like it, that kind of thing. But Bernie was always that person. And there are times when I look back at people that I knew who are older and I say, I want to be like them. And the text I think we look at here could be very well something that a lady could say, I want to be like this person when I get older in terms of service and character. Mm-hmm. And so as the text says, a widow needs to be put on the list of the service only if she's not less than 60 years old. And Sean, if you wanted to take it away from here, because you were mentioning some great things about this in our in-between.
Yeah, just in the reading I did on that, because that's always been, for me, like when I've read this passage in the past, that's been the first question of like, does that exactly translate into all circumstances? Not in the sense of it doesn't apply, but 60 years. Because, I mean, it's general knowledge that lifespans in different cultures and time frames vary. Sometimes it lengthens, sometimes it shortens. Yeah. And so in our day and time, I mean, if you turn 60 years old, people are going to throw you a good birthday, but it's not like, well, we hope you see 61. It's like, we normally assume that after 60, you're going to turn 61.
Generally, yeah.
As a general rule. And so just kind of thinking through, like, is this a principle? Do we need to better understand Paul's day? What things are like? Yeah, as I was doing some reading, it does seem that this was a age, generally speaking, that was seen as very much in your latter years. But also the other point that I thought was interesting, because that was a kind of a question I'd had, was that the implication of just simply in the time frame you're in, what years are your latter years across the board of that culture? Right. But then Kent Hughes mentions also that this is also probably an age where you're not going to get remarried, because remarriage comes up later in Paul's discussion.
Right.
And so it would seem appropriate that he would also mention an age where, the chances of these women being tempted after their own passions in that sense are not going to be there.
Which goes toward the case that the list he's talking about is a list of servants in the church who are committed to specific areas of service within the church.
Which again, they're qualified for, which is an earmark for Paul when there's going to be a particular office.
Yeah.
There are qualifications based off of previous character.
That's right.
And that's
right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. And according to, I think it was when I preached on this a long time ago, and I'm trying to go off my previous understanding, but I wanted to say that it was one of the more influential philosophers of that day. 60 years old was considered essentially retirement age. In that, like to us, it's 65. To them, it was 60 years old. That was retirement age. Although they would retire a little differently back then. For us, it's retire and go play golf on some golf course down in Florida. But for them, it was in according to the philosopher, I think it was Plato, that it was, as he influenced culture, that they retire to a life of contemplation. Which is something to really meditate on in terms of retirement. Like what does that mean exactly? What exactly is a life of contemplation at that point? But that seemed to be a good general idea in that culture. 60 years old was a marker of retirement age, where women who have moved past, as you mentioned, the passions, the desirous passions of their youth and the desire to have children. At that point, sexual desire is waning in the life of the lady, and now she is more equipped and prone to be willing to go and serve exclusively for the church. And so with that age requirement comes character qualities that are related, and the same interest in like what we call character and sexual relations is mentioned immediately afterwards when he says, having been the wife of one man. And that directly parallels the pastor in chapter 3, where he is called to be a one-womaned man. She is called to be a one-manned woman. That is to say that she is not a philanderer is a place of service in the church. If she's going to be on the list of servants in the church, she's got to be somebody who is restrained properly in her sexual passions and has the reputation of being so in that way.
And with that too, like she could have been married to two different men at two different times too. So she could have been like the more youthful lady, like Paul's going to talk about in a moment.
That's right.
Where maybe when she's 23, her husband dies, and a year later she marries somebody else, and then later in her life he dies. Yeah. So it's not to say there couldn't have been multiple marriages. But as you said, one man, woman. Yeah,
that's right, and which was why it's so important as we think through both 1 Timothy 3 and here in 1 Timothy 5, that the nature of what's being talked about are character qualities. Keep that category in mind, less about what has happened in their life, but what they are in their character. That doesn't mean that what has happened in their life is irrelevant to the issues, but that what exactly is their character in regard to their lives. And so going forward, she has to, verse 10, having had a reputation of good works. Again, ladies, if you're striving toward being the person who is the person you want to grow up to become, you want to age well, that it is good for you now in your age to be one who works hard and starts gaining that reputation for good works in your life. And again, as we're talking about, the works are not irrelevant, but they do helpfully give for us some understanding from the church. Okay, the church can attest to the fact that this lady is a good worker and that she works hard for the glory of Christ and for the good of the church. Put her on the list of these servants who will be serving in some very important specific ways, as she does not have a family to take care of her at this point.
So a question to you just on the reading of this, would you understand good works to be a general statement and then other statements following it about children, hospitality, or is the bringing up of the children, the hospitality, the washing, the caring, the devotion, etc., Is that the description of the good works?
That's a really good question.
How would you read it?
That's a really, really good question, because I think if we're going to parallel, again, the way that Paul phrases things in 1 Timothy 3, it seems like he's doing a similar thing in this regard when he says about 1 Timothy 3 that the pastors to be, the elder or overseers to be blameless, and then he starts listing traits. It's easy to believe that blamelessness and the rest of what's being described all fits under the category of being blameless.
Okay.
And so I think at this point, I think both are possible.
Okay.
That there could be general good works that are associated with it, but I think we could especially be bringing out the reality of what he's about to say. And I want to say this before we get into it in verse 10, that this text speaks directly to this whole girl boss mentality, that it's my job to be the leader, the whole, Snow White, if you've seen what's been happening with that.
Man, I'm loving watching Disney crash and burn.
Me too.
Awesome.
I'm watching YouTube videos.
Get the marshmallows out, let the fire rise.
Yeah, exactly. The more you choose the direction of what is contrary to womanhood in general, the more you're going to see you don't speak to the heart of women. And that's one thing that's being demonstrated by the whole Snow White fiasco. This girl boss, who, according to Rachel Zegler, right, is she's dreaming of being the leader that she always knew she should be. And how many women innately in them are like, yeah, sorry, no, I'm interested in the way that I've been designed.
Here's an irony in that too. I know we're kind of going on a sidebar here, but like I couldn't help but laugh. Because the way the actress worded it was being the leader that her father always thought she could be. So I was like, wait. In this whole narrative that you're casting in this kind of new Snow White, the person of inspiration is a straight male. Like, why not at least be consistent and say that her mother always thought that she could be, and so maybe in honor of her mother's death or something she's pursuing it. But he actually gave, like, the actress, I'm using the actress's words describing the narrative, that Snow White is inspired by her father's. I'm like, it's a straight dude.
Yeah.
Maybe Disney overlooked that fact. I don't know.
Well, and this is why, I mean, we could keep talking about wokeness, but you can never go woke enough, right?
No, you can't.
And
You
that's
cannot be
where
woke enough.
somebody who's on that side, who's moving in a much more radical direction, could point that out. And again, what you'll note is even woke people don't like it. Mm-hmm. I mean, not only is it a bad narrative, a bad story, but it's not woke enough. So there's no pleasing these people. You might as well abandon trying. But anyway, going back to the text, right? Having a reputation for good works. Listen to how she is described. You ready? This is the older lady who's in her 60s at this point. If she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. So maybe there's a little more. Again, it seems like maybe there's a greater extension of those good works as well. If I could summarize, and Sean, if you would summarize perhaps the nature of those character qualities that are described, does that fit the character quality of the girl boss? Or does that fit the character quality of the opposite, of a servant?
Fits the character, fits the general idea of a woman that is diligently pursuing the sort of strength and valor that God has designed daughters of Eve to live in. Mm. And I'm not trying to dodge anything except to say that when we swim in the culture that looks more like Snow White than this, we have to be reminded, sisters in Christ, we must remind each other. I'm sounding like a girl when I say that. Let me remind you.
We need to know too,
brother,
right?
Remind that there is a strength to this.
Yes.
Me harken back to what Patke said in our last episode on this topic. He noted that family is to care for the widow before the church is.
That's right.
That's because in Paul's theology, the family unit is always primary. There are many other commands he gives where you see that bleed through, where Paul gives emphasis to the family unit, the household. That is not only Paul, that is biblical all the way back to the Garden of Eden. The household is the foundation stone, is a foundation stone of society, and in this context, in our conversation, it is one of the building blocks of the church.
Yes.
And so when we think of the woman's role inside of that glorious institution, we need to begin to see the goodness the responsibility, the potential of that, the honor of that. I hope more pastors will preach on the grandeur of the household and therefore the honor of she who is being hospitable within it, she who is raising up children, tomorrow's statesmen and pastors and doctors and tradesmen and sailors and astronauts, and that is caring for the saints in that beautiful context. One of the most delightful ways to be cared for in soul is when we enter into the house of another family of God, and that's hospitality. That is the idea of caring for the afflicted, of washing the feet of the saints. And so this is a long answer, but that's how I would summarize all the thoughts in my head about that command, the description.
Going back to the illustration of Snow White, right? The whole difference between the modern rendition of Snow White and the 1937 version of Snow White. And this keeps getting brought out. Every YouTube video, I haven't seen the movie, but every YouTube video I watch on it, it points out the same thing. Here in the old version of Snow White has made her way into the dwarves' houses, and because they are giving her shelter and protection, she decides to demonstrate care in helping take care of the house, which was something that was a sign of gratefulness and interest in blessing the men who are taking care of her. But on the other end, now the woman in the new version enters into the house of the dwarves, and she's now the one commanding them to do all the work of clean your own house, do your own work, right after they've been working and caring for their job, right? That kind of thing. That's something that people keep pointing out as a contrast between those two renditions.
Right.
And I guess as you're thinking through what fits better, and not even just to you, but to our listeners, what fits better the character qualities described in 1 Timothy chapter 5 of somebody whose life is a life of gratefulness and care and interest in blessing other people in the way that's described and even in that movie? Which fits better? I would argue the earlier one, of course, but I love that you're bringing out, because this really is strength. I mean, that is not weakness.
No.
Service, especially do the comparison work between how 1 Timothy 5 describes the fact that she washes the saints' feet. Who else do you know of in Scripture who washed the saints' feet? Christ, right? John chapter 13 describes Jesus washing his own disciples' feet. Who was the greater in rank, in personhood, in reality? It was the Lord. And if we're called to be servants like that, you're not effectively becoming any less of a person in terms of your worth, your value. You're imitating the very one who has loved you in ways that men should be doing too, particularly. The imagery and the understanding of these things is not what the world tries to tell us that it is. And so if we understand the fullness of the Christian faith, the fullness of what we're called to as Christians, the gospel itself as well, we realize that this is the proper extension of our living in this way, and particularly ladies that are described here in this text. Yeah, sorry, I'm going to check time. So she has assisted those in distress, and she's devoted herself to every good work. All the things that you would expect, not only associated with this, with hospitality and care and raising of children, but also every kind of quality of character that you might expect that would be a part of womanhood. And I mean, I've talked about this too. We just did we're doing a study on biblical manhood and biblical womanhood in Sunday school, and I brought out the basic traits you might think of manhood, for example, is strength, right? If I speak to the heart of men, I want to speak to the heart of their desire and their interest in strength. Physical strength, using it for good and for right purposes, moral strength, strength of character, strength of proper affections. When we think of womanhood, what would be a good equivalent or a good opposite end of thing? It's not weakness, but it is
a different strength.
It's a different strength, right? Very often I think of, let's just be honest, women are beautiful. I mean, like in ways that men are not.
Yeah, that's why they call it the fair sex, because it just I mean that's not a bad statement, but yeah, women are just more beautiful.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Let's just be honest, right? There is a beauty that God has equipped women with that we can be so grateful for in His design. And for women too, and I wouldn't say that it's just physical beauty that a woman has, but we should also reckon with the idea that physical beauty also works itself out outwardly too. Because what does a woman do naturally? She is physically beautiful in her person. She adorns herself in physical beauty, depending on how she dresses, and we're not talking about modesty. We're just talking about general beauty, okay? In the way that she dresses, in the way that even she makes herself up, does her hair. She has a designed and innate interest, generally speaking, in beauty. And also, what is the job, or not the job, but the natural desire of women when she begins to be the wife in the household, but to beautify that house? She takes the beauty and the interest she has in beauty to decorate her life with beauty. And in a way that men just aren't naturally prone to do, but things that we can look at the woman and how she does and what she does and appreciates. Mm-hmm. In addition to that beauty is care. I think that's a beautiful feminine trait that men obviously generally can be caring, but not in the way that women can.
No, and that's why I think the complement between the kinds of strength, because there's a lot more if we were on this topic that we could discuss various kinds of strength that men generally carry and various kinds of strength that women generally carry. But in what Patke has unpacked, I love saying that, what Patke has unpacked,
I like saying that
I will
too.
never get over that.
Do it.
But is the general design of creation. One of the foundational aspects of creation is its practicality and its beauty. One quick example of that: the Garden of Eden. The trees planted by God were pleasing to the eye and good for fruit. They were beautiful. They were also practical. Yeah. And so we see that within the design of men and women, namely as they come together in marriage, that there are different kinds of strengths that complement each other. They're not at war with each other. They're not opposed to each other. They're not contradictory. But when God's good design is allowed to take place, there is flourishing like you'll never see.
Oh, I love that. Oh, that's beautiful, right? Because what we both, and we would all recognize, and Christianity should recognize, right? Men and women both are created in the image of God, and each in each person on an individual basis, and collectively as men and collectively as women, we reflect the image of God in a distinct way, in a different way, but it's still the image of God. I mean, even as we think practically speaking, some men are just really good at fixing things. And in that way, they exemplify the character of their Creator who made the world, right?
And restores it.
And restores it, right?
Restores it.
Exactly. But other men aren't as good at that, but they tend to be a lot more... I'm interested in reason and thinking and thought and logic, as well as care and affection, those kinds of things. And we need men of all sorts. In the same way, women reflect the beauty of God, generally speaking. Not to say that that's to the exclusion of the other parts to it, but there's more to it. And as you look at creation, as you described, creation demonstrates a beauty that is a part of the character of God that women, generally speaking, exemplify in so many remarkable ways that not only men appreciate, but other women appreciate. And ultimately, the beauty we're looking at is not merely external, but it is an internal beauty of a modest heart who's not interested in putting myself out in a sinful way, but being interested in doing what I'm called to do, loving the God that I'm called to love, fulfilling the work that I've been called to fulfill in affections toward my God, and always, always a woman who puts herself in that regard is always cherished in that way. I mean, by God, He sees that as valuable, and the people of God who love God and see that also love that and value that as well.
Right. Yeah, these are the kind of good works that every young girl, every youth should be seeking to emulate, because Paul isn't saying this only about widows. He's talking about what has marked their life. And so this is, again, to parallel the passage regarding the qualifications for the pastor, the elder. That is not to say that this is a unique, elite group of men, but it is what consistent, godly manhood looks like. And that's what you want in the office of the elder. And so in this case, this is what consistent godliness in womanhood looks like. And so whether you one day, young girl, young lady, should die before your husband, regardless of that, these are characteristics that are noble and are worthy of diligent pursuits.
I love that. Yeah, you're so good, right? You're so right, because 1 Timothy 3, all the traits of the pastor in that text are just general traits of a mature Christian.
Yep.
And the same way, these traits are looking at it from a different angle when it comes to womanhood. It is a mature woman, not only in age, because we could talk a little bit about, maybe we'll just talk generally because our time's just going to be gone in a few minutes, but in the age and the tried level of maturity that we've seen in her life, but also in exactly what every woman should strive for, in how I think this speaks to the heart of every woman who's created in God's image, and it can challenge us and cause us to love our God and to be faithful in the ways that He's called us to be, and cherish those things as well. Well, by contrast, I don't know if you want to say anything else, but by contrast, what we have now in this text, we're looking at verse 11. We already talked about the idea of a woman being 60 years old, but Paul in this context is saying refuse younger widows, verse 11, to be put on the list, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married. Now, there's nothing wrong with a woman who's lost her husband getting remarried, but to be put on a list of specific service, of commitment to the church in ways that would you're trying to be reliably useful for the cause of Christ through your church in that regard. The way you could be most reliable is not to commit yourself to the same works that the older ladies are, or the same list of commitment, but to go and get married. You're at a point where you're still able to bear children. God has rightly and healthily and naturally designed women with sexual desires that are to be met in her husband. And so he says, don't put them on the list of service, because the desires of their heart are going to lead them to, having been committed to serving, go back on that commitment. And in that way, he says they experience a level of, as verse 12 says, thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge. Now, condemnation in Scripture doesn't always mean going to hell. That's certainly not what this is talking about.
No, it's a quick example of that when Paul condemns Peter's actions in the book of Galatians. He says Peter stood condemned. That's the wording in Galatians.
That's right.
And so that does not necessitate that Peter is in hell, but it is just a term of judging someone. Consequence.
They've crossed the line, right? They've crossed the line. They've made a previous commitment, and they've gone against that commitment. And that's something that we don't want to have at all in the life of our church. We want them to make sure that they're speaking according to their conscience and making commitments that they can fulfill and trying to help along those lines as well. And so that's the big part. Condemnation as a result of a broken commitment to service. Because he says that, verse 12, thus incurring condemnation. Why? Because they have set aside their previous pledge. That's the point. They have pledged to serve, but they're going against that pledge.
Right. That'd be an interesting episode sometime on Christians and vows and pledges.
Yeah.
Because there's different verses about that kind of idea. It'd be an interesting episode to go through sometime.
That would be good. That'd be good. And at the same time, because what we're seeing too, just like the older widows who do not have the ability to be supported by their family and are thus relying on the church for support in chapter 5. So we have what happens when, the older widows who could be living in wanton pleasure. We have the negative side of that. We also see the negative side of younger widows in terms of their potential character, because we start seeing sins that were taking place in Ephesus that are mentioned here. Verse 13, at the same time, they also learn to be idle as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Here, an older woman who is mature in her faith and has learned to control her tongue in these ways, at least in Ephesus where they were at, would be less prone to be moving in that same direction and speaking in a gossip way. As they're going around serving in other people's houses, not having the character that the women in Ephesus should have had, they, instead of serving, they just sit around and talk, which isn't bad to sit around and talk. We want to have those kinds of responses. But when that talk, at least for the ladies in Ephesus, lends toward a gossip which had been happening apparently that Paul is condemning and correcting, these women were not to be put on the list of service because of their character qualities that's going against that service. Okay? And we get to the end. Therefore, verse 14, he gives the solution. I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach. Once again, we go back to the idea of these sorts of things. This is what young women are to strive for so that they can become the older women that are described in the character traits that we see earlier on in the passage. Go back, get married, bear children, take care of the household, and in that way, as he says, it gives the enemy no occasion for reproach. As the women would be committed to service without the proper character traits that were taking place, this would cause a reproach in the name of Christ, not only because of the gossip, but because of the other areas of sin that needed to be addressed there. And he says, let's make sure that as the church is functioning properly in Ephesus, that we do what we can to make sure that the church is not reproached, the name of Christ is not reproached, and good things result in the life of the church through the work that these women are called to do.
I got a question for you, Packy, before we wrap up here. So we've just gone through this teaching of Paul, like there's an enrollment for widows that want to serve in a particular way. We've talked about some parallels between this and chapter 3, where there's qualifications given for men. But at the end of that, you have the qualifications for men unto the eldership, but then also for deacons. And then there's the list regarding the deacon's wife. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what your understanding is of that, if that's just the wife or if it's also given the implication of a woman as a deacon holding a deacon office. My question in light of that is, do you see any overlap between what is said of the deacon's wife in chapter 3 and the office, or maybe not say office, but the formal function that is being talked about here?
That's a good question. As we're talking about that in 1 Timothy chapter 3, there is debate on that passage. And in fact, I was at a church that had deaconesses because apparently a previous pastor had that and believed that 1 Timothy 3, when it talks about the Greek word gune, which simply means women, it could mean women in general, it could mean wife in general. And so there's debate on how that should be translated and what role that should be because it's in the context of deacons. But I'll just say the deaconesses in that church where I was at, their role wasn't to be like the leadership of the church, but their role was to help serve. They helped serve, get stuff together for communion and things like that. They had different roles in areas of background service, and that was how that was understood. I would say I think I lean toward it being talking about the deacons' wives and kids, because I think, again, we start seeing parallels in language in 1 Timothy 3 to the pastor, because in that context of 1 Timothy 3 talking about deacons, he's talking about the relationship of the deacon, and in that context, he says that he has children that essentially maintain the faith, right?
Okay.
He's talking about the wife on the one end and the children on the other. It seems best to say that there's parallel on that. Now, I'm not going to, it'd be cool to have a debate with somebody on that. I think that would be a much smaller exegetical point that we would talk about, but yeah, so starting with that, I also do think that it's possible that there is a connection, and I should probably look at the exact wording of what the wife is supposed to have and read that for us. The wife of the deacon in chapter 3, that these men must be first tested. All right, verse 11, they're talking about the deacons. Let's look at verse 8. We'll start. Deacons likewise must be men of dignity, not double-tongued or addicted to wine or fond of sordid gain, but holding the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. These men must also first be tested, then let them serve as deacons if they are beyond reproach. Again, paralleling the novice idea of chapter 3. A pastor can't be a novice, and in that way, these men have to be tested in a similar way. We start seeing parallels between these two things because some of them are almost identical to what the pastor is called to. And we look at verse 11. Women must likewise be dignified, not malicious gossips, but temperate and faithful in all things. Deacons must be the husbands of only one wife. And so we say the women, that word again could be gune, which is their wives, or it could be gune, which means women in that way, and that we're seeing a connection between those two things. But again, that they must be the husband of one wife and good managers. So the women in verse 11 must be dignified, not malicious gossips, but temperate, faithful in all things. I think those also parallel the idea, to answer your question, of of the mature lady that's being described here in chapter 5.
All right.
Folks, thanks so much for joining us in this installment of Theologic. I think probably the next time you're going to hear Zach Deacon being a part of it. His session is winding up right now. Keep praying for him as he's finishing up session. It's going to go lengthier this year, and we'll see him. You'll likely see him in our next topical episode. I make no promises. I don't know what's going to happen, but Lord willing. Lord bless you, folks. Again, thanks for joining us. You take care.